Hi, Misha here, and I've got a new release from Corgi. Not hearing a lot from Corgi since the whole COVID thing. To be fair, they were always a little slow in getting releases out, and this one was slow even before. This is their German World War II Junkers Ju-88A-5. Circa 1940, Battle of Britain. So a relatively early Ju-88. I just thought I'd talk briefly about it. I will probably do a bigger video looking at German bombers, the He-111, the Do-17, He-111, and the Ju-88 here, because these three formed pretty much the triad of the German bomber force. And this was considered a medium bomber in German parlance. Although, if you compare it to American or British bombers, especially the big ones, it is quite small. And for comparison, just because I bred out a Corgi BF-109, call it the Junkers Escort. Why don't we? But yeah, this model was supposed to be out almost a year ago. It was supposed to be out, and I don't even remember. It's been pushed back several times and nearly came in January, and then didn't, and then it was supposed to be in March, and then the whole COVID thing, and I honestly thought it wouldn't come out, and then it kind of came in on a small order in May. But just to have more fun, I immediately got it from Pete's Collectibles because I had it on pre-order for a long time, and he shipped it out immediately, and then the mail decided to hang on to it for about 2 weeks. So it took a while to get here. With that said, that's why I just thought I'd do kind of an introduction video. Like most Corgis, this is 1/72 scale diecast, and it comes with the options of gear up or down, and that's about it. You also get spinning propellers. You get crew figures inside, and it's a small thing, but the rear gun, the flexible mount, is actually flexible. You can position it and move it, which is, I think, kind of neat. It even kind of goes in a bit for pointing up. Otherwise, it's a pretty basic plane. The good thing is, it is pretty much all metal, except for the obvious things like the props. And it comes with a pretty decent metal stem stand with a plastic base. Corgi has done Ju-88s before, but it has been a little while. And it's an interesting aircraft. It seems like Corgi does well in their bombers. As for the history of this plane, it began at Junkers as the Ju-85 prototype. First kind of seen in 1935. And based on that and kind of a symbiotic thing, the Air Ministry issued specifications for a new Schnellführer, fast bomber, in August of that year. And they wanted it to have a crew of 3. They wanted it to be able to carry 800 to 1,000 kilograms ordnance. Obviously, they wanted it to be fast. And they really didn't want it to be armed. They thought it should be fast enough that it can outrun any enemy aircraft. In 1935, this probably met that thing. But of course, by 1940, when it really went into service in any numbers, that was no longer the case. Showing off what they had, in June of 1936, 5 prototypes were ordered, and the first of these would fly on December 21st of that year. This would be at the time when it would evolve into the Ju-88. The biggest difference being the tail and some other, sorts of things. And from the beginning, Hermann Goering was very happy with the result of the initial prototype. It got up to 360 miles per hour, and it just had the fast bomber performance, and he was always kind of a big fan of twin-engine planes. In 1937, though, the decision was taken to make it into a dive bomber as well as conventional or tactical bomber. So dive brakes were added. A fourth crew member would soon be added. Armament would be added, and therefore the weight would go up, decreasing the top speed. It was planned to go into service in 1938, but through production delays and other difficulties, it actually barely scraped into production before World War II began in September of 1939. In fact, for the invasion of Poland in September, they only had about a dozen Ju-88A models, A1s, to be used. So it really had no impact at all in Poland, although they did get to try it out. In 1940, it was used again in Norway, and actually it was used there primarily as an anti-shipping plane. It was used as a dive bomber against Allied vessels, and on April 9th, a squadron of Ju-88s actually damaged the battleship Rodney, although they didn't sink her, of course. And they did sink her escort destroyer. Moving into May and June, she was used in invasion of France. And by this time, they were really available in numbers. They destroyed nearly 250 French aircraft while still on the ground. They also severely damaged the French railway system. And they also damaged shipping off the coast, including a large liner, I forget the name of right now, in June of that year. The next place they would be used would be for the Battle of Britain, and they would show up in July, but really not in numbers until August. And that's really when the shortcomings started to become visible. Before I go deeper into that, what do we have here as far as an aircraft? As I said, it has a crew of 4. We have pilot, of course. And you notice the cockpit is quite interesting, the crew quarters. It's actually a multi-deck kind of arrangement. You have this gondola below. Next to the pilot, and kind of down here, we have the bombardier, who's also the nose gunner. In the gondola, we have the navigator / ventral rear gunner. And up top, we have the radio operator / well, I guess you'd call him a tail gunner. And initially, there would be 4 8mm machine guns, although, based on lessons learned in the Battle of Britain, this would be up to 6. They would double the number down in the gondola and facing rear. They would double those up there. As far as bomb capability, it had 2 internal bays. One could carry about 2,000 kilograms. The other one could carry just over 1,000, like 1,100 kilograms. So internal bomb load was about 3.1 kilograms there. Or you could attach up to 6,600 pounds externally on pylons under the wings. But this came at a big cost of drag and whatnot, and had a lot of other detractions, so typically the internal bays would be used. They did give it uprated engines, which got the top speed, which had sunk as low as 290 miles per hour in earlier versions. It would eventually climb back up to near 310 to 320 miles per hour. Maximum altitude was anywhere between 27 and 29,000 feet, depending on the variant and how heavily laden it was. In the crew compartment, the crew cabin, was an interesting arrangement that was very German. Whereas Allied bombers had turrets with the crew spread about all of the plane, the Germans had a different philosophy. They wanted to concentrate their crew together. They thought this would make communication easier. They also thought it would give a morale boost, having everyone together. But of course, the obvious detractions would be your firepower is all in one spot. And obviously, it's kind of an eggs in one basket type situation. It was also quite cramped. In fact, sometimes the navigators would remove their machine gun just so they had room to get to their tables and charts without having to bump into it. Also, early on especially, the machine guns were drum-fed, meaning they needed to be reloaded. Overall length of the plane was just over 47 feet, and the wingspan was a little under 66 feet. So that was the initial version. Even though it was originally designed as a tactical bomber and then soon dive bomber, it would end up being used for many roles. It would also be used as a torpedo bomber in a different variant. It would also be used as a heavy fighter, something Goering wasn't a fan of. He wanted bombers, but eventually in 1940 they just went ahead with making heavy fighter versions, the 88C, without his consent, really. These would have a solid nose instead of a glass nose or glazed nose. And they would have the different cannon arrangement. They would usually have a 20mm cannon and additional 8mm machine guns in the nose. And they would still be able to carry bombs, but not 3,000 kilograms as in this. They would also use different engines. A variant of the 88C would be used as a night fighter with radar. Then a dedicated night fighter would be used to the 88G. There would also be a reconnaissance long-range version, the 88D. The Bs, by the way, seemed to be just prototypes or whatever, non-standard production models. They didn't make that many, so they pretty much jumped from the A's to the C's. There was also the 88P and 88S, but yeah, there's different variations. Most made were the A's, the C's, and the G's. So you're already seeing it being fitted into roles it was not intended for. Sometimes to great effect, other times not. But to be honest, even though the fitting out of the plane would change throughout the war, honestly, the airframe itself would change very little, with perhaps the 88G being the biggest change. As for its service, as I said, they started to deploy these in small numbers in July of 1940 over Britain, and then in ever-increasing numbers in August through October. This was flown along with the DO-17 and the He-111, HE-111, DO-17. But it actually had the highest loss rate. Between July and October of 1940, over 300 would be lost. Now, the number is a little misleading, and it's not exactly a jab at the Ju-88. First off, all of Germany's bombers suffered mightily over the British landmass in the skies, thanks in large part to Spitfires and Hurricanes, but also just because they were operating over hostile territory at range and, of course, British use of radar. And another thing, the Ju-88, it was a new plane. It was quite high performance for its day, and it had a reputation for being a difficult to fly plane. And since it had just really gone into service, all of the crews were pretty new to it, whereas the 111 and the 17, especially the 17, had been in service for considerable amounts of time. So much so that it's often repeated that a lot of people assigned to the 88 were actually asking to be transferred to the 111. So of the 300 lost, nearly half were actually lost to training accidents, mechanical failures, or other types of accidents. Based on this early feedback, we would end up with the A4 variant, which went to a new wing, slightly longer, with rounded tips for better characteristics. They would start adding more armor to the cockpit to protect the crew, and this would be when they start adding the additional machine guns. The 88A-4 would come from the factory with these updates. The 88A-5, which this model is here, would actually be older A1s updated to the new standard. Now, moving into 1941 and Russia, the main bomber aircraft were the 111 and the 88. By this time, June of 1941, the 17s were being pulled out of service. And early on June 22nd and 23rd, the 88s played a major part in their dive bombing capabilities of obliterating the Soviet Air Force. On the southern end of things, they definitely did a very good job. They knocked out multiple bomber wings, but in the north, they destroyed over 450 Soviet planes, nearly 200 of those bombers while still on the ground. On top of that, they also destroyed dozens of tanks and trucks, and they also pulverized Russia's rail system, and they were used throughout June and July to destroy Soviet shipping. They were very good dive bombers. They had very good accuracy, and their relatively small bomb load, which in 1941 wasn't that small, although as the war would go on, it would be more so-and-so. But they were able to deliver what bombs they had with very good accuracy. And of course, they had very good aircraft escorting them, like the Bf-109 and eventually the FW-190, the Focke-Wulf. So early on, they had dominance, but because of a shortage of Ju-87 Stukas, they did try to deploy these in a ground support, a ground attack role, and there they didn't do nearly as well. Losses were much higher. Their lack of heavy armor really showed, and their relatively light armament showed. So they weren't just completely winning the day. But that was early on, and if you watch any of my videos or know any of the Russian history, you know that 1942, Russia started to get parity with Germany, and by 1943, thanks to better training and better aircraft, Russia started to really dominate the Germans, and the Ju-88 was no exception. Even with newer models like the 88C coming into play, it was a design that started off in 1935, 1936, and its age really started to show by 1943. It did have a kind of a feather in its cap in 1943 when it did attack the Italian port of Bari. The Allies had landed there and had a lot of ships in the harbor and were a little overconfident in not having air coverage for their landing there, and so several Ju-88s were sent in to dive bomb, and they ended up sinking a total of 20 Allied ships. Now, keep in mind, these weren't battleships necessarily. They were more transports and freighters, but still yet. But the problem with, even though it was a very good dive bomber on that sense, because the airframe had not initially been designed for it, they quickly discovered that the stresses were really ripping apart the aircraft, the frames. They were giving stress fractures. So in that same year, they stopped true dive bombing and went to more of a hybrid traditional and dive bomb at about a 45-degree angle type bombing. They were still accurate, but it did sacrifice something. But at this point, Germany was on a defensive war, and they just weren't able to produce the planes, and they had to be better with their resources. Moving into 1944, they did try to deploy Ju-88s during the Normandy invasion, the D-Day landings, but they were ineffective and in suffering heavy losses, so they were quickly pulled out within a few days. From there, they would be used attacking ground targets as the Allies marched towards Berlin. The same, the Soviets marched towards Berlin, but increasingly fuel shortages, and since this had such a heavy demand on their pilots, as they lost more and more skilled pilots, they really just didn't have anyone to fly the Ju-88, at least not effectively. Nevertheless, they would keep production up until the end of the war, building over 15,000 of these, more than any of the other two German bombers, and it would arguably be the most effective and versatile. In fact, it was really one of the best two-engined aircraft of World War II, just based on how many roles it was able to fulfill. And kind of funny, in 1939, as they were finally getting ready to do production after over a year of delays, they promised the Luftwaffe they could produce 300 of these a month, and in the beginning they were barely able to make one a week. Of course, that was definitely increased, as you can tell by the total numbers, by the end of the war. But again, the airframe changed very little. The technology involved changed very little. So by 1945, this was nearly a decades-old design, whereas you have America flying the B-24, the B-26, and of course, even though it wasn't in Europe, the B-29, and the British had the Lancaster, the Sterling, and the Halifax. This is kind of analogous to the Wellington. Just imagine if Britain had kind of stuck to the Wellington throughout the war. Or if America had stuck to the B-17 alone, or even some older twin-engine designs that they had. Not to denigrate it, it actually held its own very well, but it definitely was a mixed bag plane. That said, it did stay in service after the war in France, who actually ended up with quite a bit of German hardware. I wonder why. And a very interesting little side note, in 1943, the Finns would purchase 24 of these from Russia. Actually, there we go. From Germany to use against Russia. But recognizing the difficulty of flying these and training crews, they actually spent most of that year until the end just training their crews and getting them proficient with it. Even then, they lost a pretty high number to mechanical accidents and training accidents. But they still were flying them in 1944. Although they didn't use them on many missions against the Russians, they did during what was known as the Continuation War. And even more interestingly, after the Continuation War, there was the Lapland War, which saw the Finns fighting the Germans. So the Ju-88s that the Finns had actually were flown against the Germans at the end of 1944, running through around April of 1945. But yeah, I probably will do a larger video kind of comparing this to the HE-111 and the DO-17. And I have done a pretty long, extensive video on the JU-87 Stuka, so if you haven't seen it, you might enjoy it. But since I waited a long time for this airplane to come in, having it on pre-order for a year, I just wanted to do something for it. It is an interesting aircraft. I love the seating arrangement. I don't know. It's so different from the Allied way of having everyone up here, and it's almost like a triple-decker cockpit. Even though a lot of times they would have to lay on their bellies. It's mechanically just a very different design. And these huge three-bladed propellers. It also had a very neat landing gear that actually twisted when it came up into the bay. It was a single strut style. Kind of unique, but not one of a kind, of course. The P-40 had it as well. But yeah, the JU-88A-5, circa, I believe, around October, maybe September of 1940, during the raids over Britain. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.